Chapter 2. I want to go back and give you a little bit of a summary, if you will, and kind of make some application for the whole book. But really, we're going to focus on chapter 2. But the first chapter of Nahum makes it clear that God's judgment is about to fall on Nineveh because of her idolatry, her pride, and her wickedness. And chapter 2 is a prophetic lens, if you will, through which we're going to be able to catch a glimpse of these terrible judgment that's about to take place and Nineveh's going to fall. The reoccurring theme is harsh, this unstoppable judgment coupled with God's salvation for his own people. That's what we see in chapters 1 and chapter 2. But what does that really mean for us? I mean, why are we here, 2,800 years after this fact, and why are we studying it now, and how can we benefit from it? Well, when we read the minor prophets in the world that has basically just cast out judgment from its vocabulary, we read it to learn what God's judgment reveals about his character and what it means to us today. And God himself, we'll see in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we're going to see that God himself is coming to battle. And the prophet Nahum is like he's bellowing out, get ready, here he comes. And so what sort of army could possibly stand against God's wrath? And Nahum makes it clear that God himself is coming, and he's coming in vengeance, and he's coming in the very wrath of God. And so when we see that, we see the magnitude of the one who is coming to judgment, and there's absolutely no way to stop him. They've mocked him, they've made fun of him, they've belittled him, they've committed all kinds of idolatries, they've committed all kinds of atrocities. And now God has I am casting my judgment on you. And now all their attempts to try to stay away from judgment is going to fall. And so what we're going to see in chapter 2, especially verses 3 through 5, we're going to see this flurry of action, if you will, as God's wrath is manifested. We're going to see physical boots on the ground. We're going to see horses and wheels and chariots on the ground. And what is happening, the siege is taking place. And we're going to see how in God's justice and in God's judgment, he takes the whole city and besieges the city. We're going to see the river gates open up and the palace just kind of melts away, if you will, in chapter 2 and verse 6. And so that great river and those great walls that had been impenetrable before will no longer be impenetrable. And he's even going to cry out to his generals, his generals is who the king used to depend on to fight all his armies that were coming against him. But who can fight God? Those generals were great when they're fighting normal armies, but not when those armies are backed up with God's wrath. So the actual siege of Nineveh took 3 months to succeed from the very beginning when he first started making siege. But these verses really here show judgment from God's perspective. And so God had decreed judgment. Judgment would come, and it is guaranteed. And God says, I guarantee it. And so the same can really be said for our lives in the world in which we live, because we build up walls ourselves. We build up walls of security and a well-paying job and a good name. And some people have good looks they depend on. Some have charisma that they depend on. And so we fill our lives with all these things that we depend on for our safety and for our security. And so we build all these walls up, very much like Nineveh did, except that ours are not necessarily physical walls. But the question is, will these stand? When we stand before God, will these things stand in the world we live today? When we see impending judgment coming against those who mock God, and there's a lot of people today mocking God, the walls that we have built, maybe we need to do a self-examination ourselves, because we think if you give us enough time and we can work this out. Well, when God's coming, you can't work it out, because God has already preordained that this is where it's going to happen, and it will happen. And so when we think about this, in verses 10 through 13, we're going to see the terrible judgment against them because of their sin. If there's anything more terrifying than these 8 words in Hebrew, it says, when God says, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. That's 8 Hebrew words. Think about it for a moment, though. I am against you. I'm against you, declares the Lord of hosts. What could be more terrifying? You can't stand up against him. You can't fight with him. You're not going to win. If God says, I am against you, that's a bad place to be. I can't think of anything worse than for God of the universe, who has all power, all authority, all wisdom, all knowledge, for him to say, Ed, I am against you. And that's exactly what it says to Nineveh. To all of Nineveh, to all of the Assyrians, I am against you. Why? Because you've mocked me and you've belittled me. And so God's judgment is coming. It's just not any different today. The Apostle Paul even tells us about the judgment in Acts chapter 17, verses 29 through 31. He says, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that divine being is like gold or silver or stone or an image formed by art or imagination of man. The times of ignorance God has overlooked. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has a fixed day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance that by all the raising him from the dead. Of course, we know he's talking about Jesus. God has appointed a day that God says, I will judge the world. And whether you're ready or not, it really will not matter, because God says, I've appointed a day. I've even appointed a man by which it's going to happen. And we know that the death and burial and resurrection has already happened. And so that's when judgment started against us. But when he comes back, we're going to have the other judgment. And so in Nahum chapter 2, verse 2 reminds us that God is a personal God of judgment, but he's also a loving God, because at the same time he's judging Nineveh, he is freeing, if you will, Judah, and he's taking up for them and for Israel. And he even says, I'm going to restore Jacob. Think about that for a moment. Remember in Genesis 32 where he made an agreement with Jacob? I will bless you, and he blessed him. God hasn't forgotten that. And so all the descendants from Jacob, he says, I am going to defend you. I'm going to deliver you. I'm going to rescue you. So the name of Jacob still means something to God. The name of Israel still means something to God. All right, Nahum, that's kind of an introduction. Nahum chapter 2, verse 1 through 13. So in chapter 2, 1 through 8, Nahum describes the actual destruction of Nineveh. He gives us these bright prophetic flashes of the events as they're leading up to. We're going to read it in just a moment, and you'll see it. Notice he starts out, he says, the one who scatters has come up to you, or come up against you. It's the one who dashes into pieces, some of them say. Well, this is a reference to Cyaxares and to Nebopalasar. These are the armies of the Medes and the Babylonians, and so these are their leaders. And he says, here he is. He says, he is one who comes up against you to scatter you. Now, Nahum begins his account where the Medes had already overthrown the Assyrian countryside. They're now coming up to Nineveh. And so you can see the old lion. Remember, the kings, the Assyrian kings, they were noted for the lions they would kill. That's why they had lions and winged lions everywhere. Because their kings were seen as lion killers. Well, if you're a lion killer, you're pretty brave. I mean, you're pretty strong. And so that's what they were seeing. So now we're going to see what he said. Where are your lions? Where are your old lions? Where's your young lions? Where are they at? And so, and why? Because these two armies are coming together, and we see the old lion going back into his den. Well, you don't normally go into the den after the old lion, but because of God's judgment, they will. So here, the countryside had already been ravaged, and now they're coming up to the last bastion where all of the king's armies would have been put together. The hills that were fortified around Nineveh, the rivers, the dikes, the moats, they had already fallen into enemy hands. And all that's left is Nineveh. But nobody is going to break the walls of Nineveh down. So they think. God has a different plan. The once impregnable Nineveh is now ready to fall because God himself is there in judgment. And of course, he's using the Medes and the the Medes and the Babylonians to defeat the Assyrians, but God is right there in their midst. And one of Nineveh's flashes, he sees the attackers, their tunics and their shields are splashed with blood. Now, we're going to read about these chariots in a moment. Now, it is true that the Assyrians did have some very decorative chariots that they would use for ceremonies. But the Babylonians and the Medes were not having those ceremonial like you would see in Ben-Hur. These were war chariots. These were chariots that had spikes sticking out of them. And these were chariots that had swords coming out of the wheels up to 2 feet long. Then it's going to talk about them weaving in and out of the city streets. What is he talking about? He's talking about if you're out, you're walking, and all the chaos is going on, and they're fighting the battle in the streets and in the alleys behind you, and you come out of your house and you're walking down the alley, and one of those chariots come by, it's going to be nothing but blood and carnage. And that's exactly what happened. And so we're going to see this. So when he talks about the chariots and the bright wheels, and he talks about these scarlet robes, why is he saying that? They are covered with the blood of the Assyrians because God has called judgment against them. There would have been mass panic and fear and carnage. In verse 5, the Assyrian king is seeking comfort. And so it says he remembers his worthies. It's talking about his generals, because these were the generals in the past that when he sent them out, they came back victorious, not 8 out of 10 times, not 9 out of 10 times. They came back victorious 10 out of 10. These were the great lion killer generals, and they were serving the king. And so he calls on them. That didn't work out too well either. He's remembering them. Where are they today? They can't stand against God. Then in verse 7, it says, it is said. And it says, she is stripped away. She is led away. Now, there's 2 thoughts on this. Some scholars say it's actually talking about the queen mother was captured and taken away. And certainly for a king to let the queen mother be captured and taken away would be a travesty. What kind of king would do that? Only a king that could not prevent it. But also, most theologians think it's actually talking about her wealth. And when we read through that passage, you'll see, because he's talking about plunder the silver and plunder the gold and all those things. So whether or not, because she had an amazing amount of wealth. She had gotten wealth. She had blamed Israel dry. She had blamed Judah dry. She blamed all the countries around. She had drained blood. And she had plenty of wealth. So if you lose your wealth, remember Solomon? And he lost all the wealth and still having gold shields. He had what? Bronze shields, which kind of give the appearance of gold from a distance, but it's not gold. And it was a travesty that Solomon would let all of Israel's wealth be taken away. But he had no choice or be overthrown. Well, here in Nineveh, whether it was the queen mother or whether it was the wealth, both would be devastating. Both the king not only lose his face, he'll wind up losing his life over it. And in chapter 2, verse 9 through 13, Nahum's prophetic description here talks about absolute plunder. He says in verse 9, plunder the silver and plunder the gold, for there is no end of this treasure. And then he says, she is emptied. And that's one reason I think that maybe the theologians that say they're talking about the wealth is probably more than the queen mother. Either one would have been a travesty. But for them to actually empty all the treasure out, he has just totally lost face. He has no power whatsoever because now they have nothing to even rebuild on. And so we see that Nahum paints a picture of Nineveh's plight, and they're emptied and void and waste. The best way to describe Nineveh after God's judging is she is laid to waste. Now, Xenophon of Athens, he was a Athenian-born military leader, philosopher and historian. At the age of 30, he was given the commandership of one of the largest mercenary Greek armies ever. They were known as the 10,000. This is coming from history. And it said that when he crossed over the place where Nineveh once stood, it was not even recognizable. Alexander the Great, I mentioned that on last week. I mentioned it, or it might have been on Sunday. I don't remember. I just remember mentioning Alexander. But Alexander the Great marched his men actually through downtown Nineveh beneath his feet, and they never knew that they were trampling one of the world's greatest civilizations, except it had been laid to waste. Well, think about Sodom and Gomorrah. We still, by the way, which is a good one, when God lays you to waste. It was in the 1800s when we found Nineveh, the actual city. So we said, oh, this is where it was. It was lost for all those years. We still know where Sodom and Gomorrah is. We got an idea in this region, but we don't know. God laid them to waste. And I would say that, people talk about why is America not in the book of Revelation? Maybe it's because maybe God's going to lay us to waste, and we won't matter anymore. I ain't talking about us here, but I'm talking about as a country. So with that said, let's take a look at. Let me read 1 Kings to you first, because remember 2 Kings chapter 18, the Assyrian king had boasted that no gods could ever deliver their people from the Assyrians. So here we're in 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 30 through 35. Now, Rabshakeh was the spokesman for the king. Whenever the king had something official to say to other people, he would send him out. And so Rabshakeh goes and he says, this is what the great king of the Assyrians says. Do not let Hezekiah lead you into trust in the Lord by saying, the Lord will certainly save us, and this city will not be handed over to the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for this is not what the king of Assyria says. He says, make your peace with me, and come out to me and eat. Each one of you eat from his own vine and from his own tree, or his own fig tree, and let him drink, each one of you, the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you to a land as much like your own, full of grain and new wine, and full of the land of bread and vineyards and olive trees producing oil, and land of honey, and so that you will live and not die. But do not listen to Hezekiah, because he misleads you by saying, the Lord will save us. Has any of the gods of any of the nations actually saved their land from the hand of any Assyrian king or king of Assyria? He says, where are the gods of Habeth and Pathrod? Where are the gods of Sheraphim and Hena and Iva? Have they saved Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of all the lands are there ever who have saved their land from my hand, that the Lord would save Jerusalem from my hand? Well, by him going to the king to Israel, and for him going to Judah and saying those kinds of things, that's mocking God. That's saying that the king of Assyria is more powerful than any god that there ever has been, including the Lord God, the God of army of hosts. And so this comes straight out of 2 Kings. So this kind of lays on top of what is taking place now. The king of Assyria has made these statements over and over and over, and now God says, now's judgment, and I'm coming with it, and I'm bringing it to you. So in Nahum chapter 2, verse 13, we see about the Lord's word. He says, I am against thee. Why? Why was God against him? Because of the mocking and them saying, do you really think God's going to take care of you? Why in the world would you believe Hezekiah? Why would you allow him to tell you these things that are not true? There is not a God on this earth that is powerful enough to stop the king of Assyria. Nobody else has, and you're not either. Jerusalem will fall, and God will not protect you. So you better make your plans with me, the king of Assyria, rather than with Hezekiah and God. And God says, I don't think so. So now, that is the full introduction. Nahum chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. I told you I had a lot to cover. And we're just touching the hem of the garment. Notice what he says here, with what we talked about as a backdrop. Hopefully help us, as we read through the scripture, to really see it unfold. He says, the one who scatters has come up against you. Keep watch over the fortress, watch the road, bind up your waist, summon all your strength, for the Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob, like the splendor of Israel. Even though the destroyers have laid to waste them, and they have ruined their vines, the shields of the warriors are dyed with red. The warriors are dressed in scarlet. Their chariots are filled with flashing wheel, which they are prepared to march. The juniper spears are brandished. The chariots drive wildly through the streets. They rush around the corners in public squares. Their appearances like torches, and they drive back and forth like lightnings and flashes. Then he remembers his officers, or those who were strong, the king's generals. He says, they stumble in their advance. They hurry to her wall, and the manslet is set up. The gates of the rivers are open, and the palace sways back and forth. It is set. She is stripped, she is led away, and her slave women are sobbing like the sound of doves, and they're beating their breasts. Though Nineveh was like a pool of water throughout her days, yet now she is fleeing. Stop, stop, but no one turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold, for there is no end to the treasure. Wealth from every kind of desirable object. She is emptied. She is desolate. She is laid waste. Hearts are melting and knees are wobbling, also trembling in the entire body, and all their faces have become pale. Where is the den of the lions? Where are the feeding place of the young lions? Where are the lion, the lioness, and the lion's cub, with nothing to disturb them? The lion tore enough of his cubs, killed enough prey for his lionesses, and filled their layers, or their lyres, or their layers, with prey, and their dens with torn flesh. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of armies. I will burn up her chariots with smoke, and the sword will devour the young lions. I will eliminate her prey from her land, and will no longer have the voice of her messengers to be heard. Well, it sounds kind of gruesome. And if you realize that the picture he's painting is when the river opened up and the walls began to crumble and the gates began to open up and there would have been hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of these war chariots, and you've got these soldiers in there, and they've got their swords, and they've got their shafts. They have the blade on top, and they're going through, and they're just stabbing as they go, and even the wheels as they're going back and forth as people are walking, it's just cutting people up. I mean, it would have been mass carnage. It would have been something that, if it had been on TV, we would have turned it off, you know. But that's exactly what was God's judgment on them was. And so as we look at this, the Battle of Nineveh, he starts out with, the one who scatters has come up against you. He says, keep watch over your fortress. Watch the road. Now think about this. Every road coming, remember, Nineveh was a place of all the crossroads, business were coming in. And so what you've got on every road coming in, the city's totally surrounded. All the roads that are coming in, you've got all these two armies. You've got the Medes and you've got the Babylonians coming in. And just as soon as the doors opened up, they rushed in. It took 3 months total. But when Nahum is painting this, it sounds like it's a one-day deal. And if it had only been a one-day deal, maybe it wouldn't have been quite as bad. But this is what they had to put up with for 3 months. This says the one who scatters. Nahum saw the vision here. He saw a mighty army coming against Nineveh that Nineveh could not. Nineveh thought she was prepared. She had won every other battle. She had the general. She had those old lions with wisdom. She had those young lions that were ready to take the place of the old lions. They were always winning, but not now, because God says, I've come against you. And it just goes to show you, there may be another armies against you, and you might can win it. But if God's against you, you're not going to win it. Notice he says, for the Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob. Reminds us that he made a commitment to Jacob back in Genesis. And God hasn't forgot that yet. And so here we are, generations later, and God says, I'm going to restore it. I hadn't forgot about it. Yeah, your walls were torn down. Yes, all these things happened to you, but I'm going to restore you. I'm destroying them now, and I'm going to restore you. And so when notice it says that the chariots, when they come, it's like torches. It would be flashes of light. And it would have been because they were shiny chariots. You got all this metal chrome looking things coming out from the wheels. I mean, it would have, as whether it was in sunlight or whether it was in moonlight, you were seeing all these flashes coming as they're coming down one after the other down the street. It looks like it's just torches coming after you. And notice it says they're driving back and forth like lightning flashes. It would have been something they hadn't seen before. This would have seemed like mass chaos to them, but it won. They thought they were prepared to defend the city, but they were not prepared, which just goes to show you can't prepare to fight God. God's going to win. I give up now. I'm not going to fight him. There's no need. Anybody with that much wisdom say, okay, God, have your way. He's going to have his way. And Nineveh just didn't understand it. Nineveh had gotten by, the Assyrians had gotten by with too much for too long, and actually thought that the king was stronger and more powerful than any god that anybody ever could serve, except now he comes up against the true and the living God, and he's not prepared for it. And he loses everything. He loses his city, he loses his people, he loses his army, he loses his old lions, he loses everything. Notice it says here, he is said, so she is stripped, she's led away. I think the reason some people think it's the Queen Mother when it talks about her women are sobbing like the sound of doves would be the women who serve her. So that's the reason some theologians think it's talking about the actual Queen Mother. It could be, but I think more accurately, because it talks so much about the wealth, beginning in verse 9, plunder the silver, plunder the gold, because there's nothing in the world like this wealth. There's nothing like it. And God's saying they're going to take every bit of it from you. I think they're talking about the wealth. Either one, though, would have been a travesty. It would have been terrible. But so notice it says, she is empty, she is desolate. In verse 10, and she is laid waste. The hearts are melting. The knees are wobbling. And she's trembling in her entire body. It means the city, the whole city. Everybody is scared to death. And all of their faces have become pale. In other words, picture this. You step out of your home, and there's these chariots coming by. You don't know any of this kind of stuff. You've never had to know it. Nobody's ever breached those walls before. Those walls were fortified. The only chariots you saw come through were the chariots of the Assyrians. And now you've got these Medes and these Babylonians coming through. You step out your door, and there's mass carnage where your neighbors had stepped out before, and they're driving back. And the reason they were weaving side to side was so that they could catch you between the wall and the chariot. So what would happen? It would just, as those wheels went around with those swords, it would just chop you into pieces. It says all the color drained from them. They all became pale because they didn't know how to handle it. Verse 11, where is the den of your lions? With all this going on, those lions should have come out of their den. I mean, they should have come out of there roaring, ready to fight. What is Nahum really saying here? He says, where's your lions? He's saying, where's your king? He's saying, where's Nineveh? This Nineveh here that I'm seeing, this is what Nahum will be saying, this Nineveh that I'm seeing, that is not the Nineveh that you think it is. But this is what is going to happen. And indeed, it did happen to the point where, like I said, for 2,400 years, nobody knew where Nineveh was after it was wiped away. He laid it waste. He even talks about the lions before. They would kill all these animals for the lionesses, and they would take all this tore flesh back. He says, where are they? Where are the people who's going to save you? You send all your people to us and tell us that we should side with you and not trust Hezekiah. We shouldn't put our trust in God, but where are your prophets? Where are your strong men? He says, plunder silver, plunder gold. You don't normally plunder a lion's den. But the Assyrian lion was helpless now. His teeth had been pulled. He didn't have fangs, didn't have claws anymore. He had no power because nobody can fight against God. When he says plunder the silver, plunder the gold, so pretty impressive confirmation of this prophecy that nothing was going to be left whatsoever. It was all stripped bare. Notice it says, where's the den? Where's the lions? I covered that. Notice this again. Like I said earlier, he says, behold, I am against you. I don't think there's anything that should bring more fear to the heart of any man or woman than for God to be against you. But he says, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts, and I will burn your chariots like smoke. And the sword will devour your young lions and will cut off all the prey from the earth. And the voice of your messengers will be heard no more. In other words, you'll never, from the Assyrian Empire, there will never be someone that says, my king is better than your God. And that's true. That's happened. He says, behold, I'm against you. Terrible term. Let's see. Well, the way he closes it out here with the voice of the messengers shall never be heard again. We know that they were not heard again. The whole thing about the smoke and the rising of the smoke, what does he mean by that? He means it will happen suddenly, it will happen quickly. In the Syriac text, when it says about the smoke rising, it talks about this translated suddenly, it would evaporate. In other words, you have something when it evaporates real quick in the thin air, it's gone. Where did smoke go? He said, Assyria, all your wealth, all your power, all your fame, all your fortune, everything that makes you who you are, Nineveh, poof, it's like a puff of smoke and it's gone. And the voice of your messengers will never be heard again. Well, Why is that important? Because any country, any kingdom that's going to interact with other kingdoms has to have a messenger that speaks for the king. The king himself doesn't normally go on his own behalf. He sends a messenger, and he says, your messengers? You don't have any messengers. They'll never be heard again. You'll never have influence, that's what he's saying again. Because it's that messenger working with this messenger to get the two kings to come together so they get some kind of an agreement. He says, you won't have a king, you won't even have a messenger. You won't have anything to say whatsoever. Some render it the voice, the noise of thy. One translation says the noise from your jaw, and some people think he's talking about the lions, and they were so strong and powerful and roaring. And he said some people think he's saying, "Never will your lions roar again." Could mean that, but I think really the idea of the smoke meaning when God walks through those gates and God says judgment has been cast, and at the end of it, there's going to be nothing but carnage. There'll be nobody, there'll be no king, there'll be nobody to be a messenger for them. They'll have no place in world power anymore. People will forget about them, and people had forgotten about them. Well, that's chapter 2. Any questions? I know. Yeah. Oh, there it is over there. Yes, ma'am.